Welcome to Back to the Bible. Today, Bible teacher Bryan Clark takes you to Genesis chapter 1 for a close look at what it means to be made in the image of God. Later in the program, Bryan will join us in the studio with author Kara Whitney and Back to the Bible CEO Arnie Cole for discussion that will break down today's message for your life. Now let's join Bryan Clark for our Back to the Bible study.
What does it mean to be made in the image of God? The first aspect of what it means to be made in the image of God is the relational ability, the ability to give and receive love and to enter into a relationship. Connected with that is the aspect of volition or will. The fact that we have a will, we can act volitionally, we can choose. That again separates us from the animal kingdom. It has to do with intellect, it has to do with emotions, it has to do with a lot of these things that separate us from the animals. But for there to be a legitimate relationship, there has to be a volition, there has to be a will. I have to have the ability to choose, or it's not a legitimate relationship. So the two go hand in hand. Let's imagine that I programmed my computer so that whenever the screensaver comes on, it says, "I love you." And I go to a meeting one afternoon, and it's kind of an ugly meeting, and I'm feeling all beat up, and nobody loves me. I go down to my office to sulk, and up comes the screensaver, and it says, "Bryan, I love you." Now, does that make me feel all warm and fuzzy? At least there's somebody in this world that loves me. Now, granted, there are a few people in this world that would feel warm and fuzzy from that computer. But most of us would not. Because that isn't a relationship. I programmed it in, and it just comes up on the screensaver. But if you were to go into my office this morning, you would find a message on my screensaver that says, "Bryan, I love you." And underneath it says, "Patty." Because one time, Patty, under the cloak of darkness, snuck into my office and typed that into my screensaver, so whenever it comes up, that's what it says. And I left it there because that is meaningful, because that is based on a relationship, because she has the choice every day to love me or not love me. I have the choice every day to love her or not love her. Because that's an act of my will, it's a volitional choice, that relationship is legitimate. It is meaningful. When Patty and I got married, I didn't chase her down and tackle her and sit on her and say, "I'm going to pin you to the ground until you love me." Not exactly like that anyway. It was close. But now, having lived with me all these years and finding out what a wonderful guy I am, she would say, at least today, by an act of her will, she chooses to love me. That's the only way that a relationship is legitimate, if there is that volitional choice. Therefore, we are created as volitional people, people with a will. That's a part of what it means to be made in the image of God. Now, there's some irony in all of this. The only reason that an evolutionist can even think of a theory to dismiss God, or can even make a choice to say there is no God, is because they are made in the image of God. In other words, you don't find cattle out in the pasture huddling around formulating a theory about why God doesn't exist. The animal kingdom cannot do that. The only people that can do that are people made in the image of God, can contemplate why there is no God. And therein lies the irony of all of that. But we are made as people with a will. Now, to talk about choices, then, introduces the concept of morality. And that is also a part of being made in the image of God, is we have a moral responsibility. We have a moral expectation or accountability. If I can choose as an act of my will, then I can choose right and I can choose wrong. I can choose good and I can choose evil. Therefore, I become morally responsible. In Genesis chapter 2, we're introduced to that when God puts a tree in the middle of the garden and gives Adam and Eve a directive that they must not eat from that tree. But he does say, if you choose to eat from that tree, which says you can choose to disobey me, then there will be consequences. And the rest of the Bible is really reflective of the fact that we make choices and there are consequences to those choices. Now, nowhere in the Bible do you find any discussion that animals are held morally accountable before God. They simply operate out of a God-given instinct. But we are set apart from that. We are different from that. In my home, I have a dog and I have 3 daughters. I seek to train both of them, but I go about it radically different. With my dog, I just simply try to get him to obey. I don't enter into long discussions about morality. I don't talk to him about the collie up the street. And beware of the ways of the collie and all kinds of diseases. I don't go into all these discussions with my dog. I simply tell my dog stay in the yard, and if he gets out of the yard, I smack him and put him in the yard. That's about the extent. It's a reward and punishment system. But certainly I operate differently than that with my children because I understand they are volitional beings. They have a will. They have a choice. They can think for themselves. And I enter into long discussions about morality and choices and walking in a way that's pleasing to God. And what I discuss with them is radically different from anything I try to address with my dog. Now, if you were to go into the home of an evolutionist, you would find the same thing. You would find that how they train their dog and how they train their children is radically different because in reality, it is understood that there is a quantum leap between my dog and my children. And we operate differently then. So that's that idea of morality. This idea of the image of God and a volitional will to choose does also help understand what's called the mystery of evil. Where did evil come from? A lot of people say if God is good, then why is there evil in the world? And the answer is that God created people in His image, and to be made in His image means that they are relational beings, which means that they have to have a choice. Therefore, if they can choose God, then they can choose to reject God. That is necessary. If they can choose good, then they can also choose evil. So God understood when He made people in His image that He created the potential for evil, and Adam and Eve made their choice in Genesis 3, and we live with the consequences in our world today. But to be made in His image makes it possible to choose God, but also to reject God, and good and evil then exists in our world.
You're listening to Back to the Bible. If you'd like to listen again, visit backtothebible.org. That's backtothebible.org. Now let's return to Bible teacher Bryan Clark and today's study from Genesis 1.
There's another aspect of the image of God that is very prominent, and that is the idea of rule. It's very prominent in verse 26 and 28. Where it talks about our role to rule over creation. In Psalm 8, there's also a strong emphasis as David marvels at the fact that we have been made a little lower than God and crowned with glory and majesty. That's all the image of God he's talking about. And then he launches into our responsibility to rule over creation. We are not one with creation. We are not one with our environment. We are put in a position that is set apart to rule creation, and that's very clearly stated. Now, I think we tend to dismiss this much too quickly because we don't fully understand it. We tend to think, what does that mean? That I can tell my dog what to do, or I can have power over the birds, or what does that mean exactly? Well, understand that we celebrate our ability to rule over creation in hundreds of ways every single day of our life. Because the ability to rule over creation means everything from the ability to build a community, the ability to build buildings, to have air conditioning, to have heat, the ability to have clothing, the ability to walk into a grocery store and have produce and have vegetables and have meat and have all these things at our disposal, the ability to go into a restaurant and order food, the ability to experience recreation, the ability to fly, the ability to drive a car. All of these are expressions of our ability to rule. The ability to farm, the ability to landscape, the ability to garden, the ability to put together a bouquet of flowers, music, the arts. Those are all expressions of this ability to rule. And it's one of the things that sets us apart from the animal kingdom. So it's highly significant, and we celebrate that hundreds of ways every day of our life. I want to talk about two other things related to the image of God that are often not discussed. One is this area of creativity. Part of being made in the image of God is the idea that we are creative beings. The very first thing we learn about God is in the beginning, God created. Romans 1 says all we have to do is look around at creation and we see the beauty and we know there's a God. But we can only observe that beauty because we are made in God's image. My dog never sits on the deck and admires the sunset. He just doesn't get it. He doesn't appreciate it. My dog doesn't look at the sunset and say there must be a God. I don't think he does anyway. I think my dog's an atheist, by the way. I've come to that conclusion. But I look at the sunset and I admire the beauty. And Romans 1 says through that I realize there has got to be a God. When you look at creation, you realize this is a God of aesthetics. This is a God of beauty. This is a God who has painted the landscapes. When you go through the Bible, you realize this is a God who loves drama. This is a God who loves special effects. When you see God's blueprint for the temple, you realize this is a God who loves beauty and aesthetics and architecture. God is that kind of a God. God created, and in a sense, then we recreate. God created out of nothing. We take the materials God created and we recreate, and we paint, and we make music, and we experience drama and dance and all of those things that are very unique to us as people made in God's image. That's the reason we started the School of the Arts here, is because we're convinced that the church ought to always be on the forefront of the arts, because nobody could understand the arts like people who are committed to God. People who know God intimately best understand the expression of the image of God, therefore should best understand the arts. Therefore, whether you can sing or paint or just appreciate those things, we as the people of God ought to understand that we celebrate God, we worship God when we enter into the arts, because it's uniquely ours as people made in the image of God. A last thing about the image of God that isn't often talked about, and that is, what about the physical? Sometimes we just completely dismiss the physical because God is a spirit being. Therefore, we don't look like God. We aren't shaped like God. But we do have to understand that everything that we've talked about that is a part of the image of God is expressed through these physical bodies. We cannot express any of the parts of the image of God that we've talked about apart from this body. Our mind, our hearts, our physical bodies, they are all a part of the expression of the image. Therefore, it really can't be dismissed. We just understand that we don't look like God, but we do play out the image of God, live out the image of God, celebrate the image of God in our physical beings. So in some way, it is a part of all that. When David realized again the wonder of being made in God's image, he marveled at that. It is a spectacular thing that separates us by this quantum leap from the animal kingdom to be people made in God's image. But of all the things that we've talked about, the greatest expression of what it means to be made in the image of God is the ability to enter into a meaningful, personal relationship with God. Because in the end, that was God's purpose for creating us in His image, that we might know Him, that we might worship Him, that we might have a meaningful relationship, that we would walk in harmony with Him. Because sin entered into the picture in Genesis 3, the Bible tells us we're all separated from God. It was through Jesus Christ, who died on the cross in payment for sin, that if we're willing to trust Jesus as our Savior, experience forgiveness of sin, we enter back into a relationship with God. And maybe there's a restlessness in your soul, and you're not exactly sure what it is. You just know that there's something that's filled with unrest there. There's something that isn't quite right. And maybe you're on a spiritual journey. You're looking for something that will satisfy. I'll tell you what that is. It is a restlessness to know God, to find your rest in Him. The very purpose for which you were created was to enter into a relationship with God, which is through Jesus Christ. I would invite you, if you've never trusted Jesus as your Savior, to place your trust in Him and for the first time in your life, experience the ultimate celebration of what it means to be made in the image of God and to know God personally.
Now let's go to Bryan Clark in the studio for some encouraging insights from today's study with author Kara Whitney and Back to the Bible CEO Arnie Cole.
Thanks, Bryan, for another great message. There is a difference between human beings created in God's image and the animals. And I think sometimes people almost idolize their pets. So when I came out with Unbridled Faith, was sort of written with the purpose as a way to reach and evangelize the animal lovers. Because we're all animal lovers, but there's definitely a difference between the animals and us people.
Yes, the connection between people and animals, it's real and it's powerful. And there's a lot of good that comes out of that. And in some ways, maybe a bit of a glimpse of the world to come. But there's still a distinction between people made in the image of God and animals. And I think in our culture, those lines have gotten pretty blurred. So animals aren't a substitute for that relationship with God or the relationship with one another. Those relationships need to be more of a celebration of creation and how God has made us in His image to rule over creation. That would be the correct perspective, I think.
So, Bryan, another point about being made in the image of God, we should be reflecting that image.
Yes, we have both the ability and the responsibility to image God to the world. So that's part of our calling. And at the core of that is that will to choose that's unique among us as people made in the image of God. So like Peter in 2 Peter, when he's talking about the ungodly, he refers to them as being like unreasoning animals or creatures of instinct, which is really interesting to think about because part of what's happening in our culture is kind of the ultimate virtue has become to be true to yourself. So if that's your instinct, if that's what it feels like, then to deny that is the ultimate sin, and the virtue is to just go with it. And yet, biblically, the calling is to image God to the world, so we make choices. We have a will to choose. We're not unreasoning animals. We're not driven by our instincts. So another way to think about it is if we see a stranger in a lake, a child drowning, we'll risk our own lives to try to save someone who is a stranger. Now, all of that's contrary to nature, but it reflects the image of God in us. It's what makes us different and distinct. So in a culture where there's so much anger, there's so much hatred, a culture that's become so toxic, it's like we don't have to be like that. Part of imaging God to the world is to image God's kindness, to image God's compassion, to image what it means to love your neighbors yourself. These are the choices we have to make. I think as Christians, we have to not get caught up in all this destructive behavior and choose
just
differently.
going to say that because I hear what you're saying and I agree. But then culturally, what is going on then with aborting full-term babies? How have we gotten that lost?
Yeah, some of that goes back to a previous conversation of, so the dignity of life, the sanctity of life, do we believe there's a creator God or do we believe we're here by chance? That worldview has a lot to do with whether we value life or we disadvantage others to advantage ourselves. But I think at the core, the more secular we've become, the more selfish and individualistic we've become, the more determined we are to be our own God. You can't make a community work that way. No family, no neighborhood, no community can flourish when everybody's in it for themselves. And so our calling as Christians to image God is, in a sense, to at least give people glimpses of the world as God intended it to be, which is Genesis 1 and 2, and is a picture of the new heaven, the new earth to come.
Bryan, you brought up that God is this awesome ultimate creator, and because of that, he also enjoys our creativity. That means so much to people like my sister, who's an artist, or to musicians, writers. My husband's a comedian. Anyone who can express their faith through their creativity.
So you think about what's the first thing we learn about God? Well, he's eternal in the beginning. The second thing is he's creative. In the beginning, God creative. And so there's so many things about God we don't learn any other way than through creation. You know, a sunset is an insight into the beauty and creativity of God. So where I live, we have a pond. And on a summer evening, I love to go down to the dock at sunset and listen to the orchestra. It starts with a frog and a few other things, but pretty soon it is this amazing orchestra that I think God has created because he likes it. He likes the music of it. And it's like every piece of music reflects the image of God. Every piece of art is possible because of people being made in the image of God. There's things on the floor of the ocean that no human has ever seen. And so you can only conclude God made it that way because he likes it.
Right.
He's the only one that sees it. And you think about that. That's a picture of God that we don't sometimes contemplate.
You're listening to Back to the Bible. Thanks for taking time to be with us today. If you'd like to listen to this message again, please visit us at backtothebible.org. That's backtothebible.org. Bryan Clark will be back again tomorrow with more timeless truths from the book of Genesis to help you grow in your relationship with God. So be sure to tune in here on Back to the Bible.